Sorry. There we go. Okay. So we know that we have students that come to us from in middle and high school that are having issues with their ability to access grade level content because they have some kind of deficit or challenge with their reading. And we know that as they move through those grades, they are just going to continue to encounter more and more complex text in all of their content areas. So we need to try to address those challenges they're having in reading as soon as we possibly can. We've covered many of these overarching goals of the session already. We've talked about how to identify the students in 6th through 12 that might need some interventions. We've talked about how to use screening and diagnostic assessments to identify specific skills of concern. We've talked about what to do after you have diagnosed those students briefly. And we've talked a little bit about best practices for instructions across all the different tiers of support that are highlighted in the TPLS framework. Today, we're going to dive a little deeper into that, as well as diving more into time, space, and purpose for the different types of intervention. So that can include things like scheduling, small group versus intervention, and very specifically progress monitoring, how we can use progress monitoring to make sure that our students are on track to progress through to mastery. All of this is part of an intervention program or a plan for a secondary school. So we're hoping by the end of these 4 sessions that you have at least a basic foundational knowledge of how to get this going on your campuses. So as I mentioned, these will be our objectives for today, and all you'll need today is an open mind. You may want some note-taking materials. I do ask that you actively participate as much as you possibly can when we are in the breakout rooms, and then have the breakout room handy as well. Breakout room handout handy as well. I also like to start these sessions off with a quick review of what we have already covered, at least just the highlights of it, especially for those of you that might be joining us for the first time. So I like this image a lot because I think it just very succinctly shows you the categories that students may fall into in terms of their ability to read. And it really highlights, it makes it easy to see how those 3 tiers would function in a school setting. So we know that we have 3 tiers of support: tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Tier 1 is your content reading or your core instruction that all students, it's universal instruction that all students get. Tier 2 is your supplemental instruction, and tier 3 is your intervention instruction. And then you have 3 different categories of readers. And we talked about how to categorize these, but as a review, does anybody remember? You can just put this in the chat. What is the first assessment that we would give students in this process of trying to identify students who might need intervention? What would be the first assessment we give them? I'm gonna give you a moment. Just type in the chat. It's something that we would give to all of our students probably at the beginning of the year. A literacy screener. Thank you, Terry. Yes. A literacy screener, which one could be DIBELS, that you could give students to determine if students are at risk for potential challenges with reading. So it's not going to tell you specifically what students might need support with, no specific skills, but it will tell you, is this student on grade level? Are they above grade level? Are they below? From there, we give them a diagnostic assessment, and it's in the title. It diagnoses what the specific skills are a student may be struggling with. So you don't give that to all students. You give that to the students who are below grade level, and you may even give it to some students who are like right on that cusp of grade level as well, especially if you have some other data from like teacher observations or curriculum assessments as well that might indicate the student is struggling. And from there, they're categorized into your good readers, which are your grade level and above, your weak readers, and your struggling readers. Your weak readers are usually just a little bit behind and just need a little bit of support in accessing that grade level content, whereas your struggling readers have some significant word recognition and decoding challenges in their foundational skills. And we'll dive more into that a little bit later today. But just as a review, we defined these 3 types of support. After you've administered all of those different assessments, you have to identify which types of interventions to give to which students. So that's where you want to use this tiered system to really hone in on giving them the most targeted support possible. So we've talked about in tier 2, these are just your readers who maybe have a little bit of a gap in their ability to access grade level content. And they might just need a little extra dose of support to best access that grade level content. So they need a little bit of help outside of their core instruction. And tier 3 over here is those students with the significant impairment to their ability to access grade level texts. And they are going to have some deficits in foundational reading skills. The what and the when of this levels of support chart is purposely left blank because we did not cover that last session. We will be going into it today, but we did talk about who receives each tier of support and why they receive it last time. So that's why I've left that up there. And you will hear me say this about 8 million times today, and you probably heard it about 8 million times last session if you were on. It is very important that you all remember that Tier 1 is a universal support. Every single student on your campus, all your diverse learners, they all should be receiving that Tier 1 high quality core instruction through HQIM. So it doesn't matter if they are struggling or weak reader, they are also receiving this no matter what. So I want to highlight something on the on the TPLS framework called the decision tree. I actually have it opened in another tab. It starts on page 43. Well, actually, it starts on page 38, I believe, but this one's on 43. It's at the very end of the document. So you'll see, yeah, it starts on 39, but this is K3, and it has a couple of different K3 ones, but we want to obviously look at our 412 ones. And just so you can see, there are decision trees for all of the different tiers of support. This one is just your general kind of tree to try to talk about how to get students off the ground, how to get this all started with giving them the screener. And then for each student, you can answer this question of, did the student meet or exceed grade level proficiency on the most recent literacy screener? Yes, no, and then you can follow the arrows through to help you make decisions about where a student might need support. I wanted to highlight it on the document because on the document, you can actually click on the embedded links that are throughout it. Whereas on Canopy, I just have it as like a screenshot of it. So you can't click the links on there. So I just wanted to make sure you knew where to find that in the TPLS framework. So it follows what we just talked about, where they take the screener if they have some concerns, but they did actually at grade level, perform at grade level. You can see what to do from here as far as Tier 1 support, or if you need to, if they did not perform at grade level and they were below, what happens next as far as maybe Tier 2 or Tier 3 support. And then if you were to go through the TPLS framework, and we're going to go through it today too, you'll see more specifics of what does it mean if they're in Tier 2 and how do I make instructional decisions based on some of the data that I have, and the same thing for Tier 3 as well. So it's just to help guide your thinking. And then lastly, this is the part we had to kind of fly through at the end last time because we were running out of time. So I'm hoping if you were on last session, you were able to at least go and look at this. But we talked about what the actual best practices for intervention instruction should look like. And it doesn't matter if they're in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3, every single student should be receiving very direct, explicit, and scaffolded instruction across all those tiers. That gradual release of responsibility that we all know and we know is best practice should be something that is your framework no matter which level of support your students are getting. So what changes across the levels of support is maybe how many times you model, or how many times students need the direct and explicit instruction or the guided practice. It may not be a linear progression like you see on the screen right here. It may be I model, they practice a couple times, I have to go and model again, they practice a couple times, and it depends on how severe their challenge is, how many times you'll have to kind of go back through that cycle. And I have it laid out on this chart as well that you see, like in Tier 1, it's pretty linear for the most part. You've got the model, the students will do some guided practice, and then independent. But in Tier 2 and Tier 3, you'll see that there's much more time for them to practice through guided practice. And there are definitely more times for you as a teacher to provide that direct and explicit instruction and modeling for them with appropriate scaffolds. And then lastly, we talked about how important it is for across, again, all three tiers for students to have all three of these types of practice integrated into their instruction. That deliberate practice that is devoted to improving one specific skill, retrieval practice where they have to retrieve information from memory, and spaced practice where they're practicing those skills over long periods of time. So you don't teach it on Monday and then be like, well, I taught it, and then move on and never do it again. They may need you to revisit it several times over to ensure that transfer of learning. And then students needing support beyond Tier 1 are going to need intervention plans that highlight what support they specifically need. And this is where today's going to come into play. They need to have, we need to track their growth through valid and reliable progress monitoring measures. So that's what we'll focus on once we get to the real meat and potatoes of today's lesson. But I wanted to make sure we reviewed that. So that will bring us to our first and the point of today's presentation. We're done with all the review. So let's talk a little bit more. In order for us to talk about progress monitoring in any kind of meaningful way, we actually need to talk a little bit more about those different tiers of support and a little bit more of the specifics of what goes into that. So last session, we did a lot of kind of just overview and general information. And today we'll talk about some specifics and why progress monitoring is so integral to the success of a TPLS framework run at schools and for students to be able to work towards proficiency. Because you need to be able to get that quality data throughout the process, no matter what tier they're in, to make decisions for instruction. So tier 1 core instruction, that's that universal instruction that all of your students are entitled to every day. We have some recommendations for time. I know some of you are teachers on your campus. You don't have a lot of control over this, but if you are a leader, this is something that you're going to want to make sure that you kind of just have in mind. We recommend 60 minutes of core instruction, then 30 minutes of time for intervention or extension. So roughly 90 minutes of a block. And an effective teacher should be delivering high quality instruction that is engaging. Core instruction should be highly differentiated to the needs of the students in the room. It should be working towards specific grade level standard proficiency. It should encompass all domains of language. So that means that your core instruction should have reading, writing, speaking, and listening happening regularly. It should be appropriately scaffolded to the needs of the students, and there should be direct and explicit instruction happening in core tier 1 instruction. Small group instruction that's going on during that core tier 1 lesson it should be happening, but it is not the same thing as your tier 2 supplemental instruction. So small group instruction during the tier 1 core block could be for students who need further support, but also could be for extension for the students who need to further extend their learning. It's not necessarily going to meet the needs of that supplemental support or that intervention support in tier 3. Those groups should still be homogenous, and they should still be based on the data that you have from your classroom, so that you're working on the same specific skills with those groups of students. And during your tier 1 instruction, you should only really be working with grade level materials. That's because that's the universal instruction for all students that they're getting with the HQIM. You can go below grade level in other tiers of support, but in tier 1, where you're doing that universal instruction, you should really only be working with your grade levels content. And then I want to show you the decision tree that we have for tier 1 to help you make decisions based on progress monitoring data. We'll go more in depth in a little bit about like what the data is you're actually going to pull, but it's still important for you to kind of see that this will ask you questions, and then based on your yes or no answers, you can kind of see where to progress with the student. So here the question is the student demonstrating adequate progress according to curriculum embedded local assessments and literacy screener? If the answer is yes, it tells you to continue doing what you're doing and just remember to monitor their progress. If they continue to demonstrate adequate progress throughout what you're doing and the answer continues to be yes, then you just continue with what you're doing. If the answer becomes no at any time, it shows you what to do. You come to no, it may tell you to start collecting some more data points and maybe adjust a variable or two of some small group instruction that might be happening in your tier 1 instruction, and then see what the data tells you. At that point, from those changes, is it showing that the student is now making adequate progress and they moved over to the yes column? Then you continue what you're doing. If not, it tells you some further steps to take and then to reassess if the student is or is not making that adequate progress, yes or no, and then what to do from there, where it could be they need to be elevated to another tier of support. So again, it's just there to help you guide your decisions with students. Tier 2 is your supplemental small group instruction. This is for your students who we called struggling readers earlier. They might just be a little bit behind. They usually can decode, like they don't usually have any significant deficits in their word recognition skills. So they can read what's on the page, but they might be having some trouble making meaning of what they are reading. So that's the students that will need some tier 2 support. And if you look at Scarborough's reading rope, which I know I've showed you guys before, language comprehension, which are these upper strands of the rope, that's where most of us in 612 are pretty comfortable because that's where a lot of our instruction is happening anyway. But this is the area of the rope that most of your students in tier 2 support will need help with. They might need some vocabulary strategies, or they may need help with language structures or something like that. Whereas students who have significant foundational deficits have some word recognition deficits that are like they are having trouble actually reading the words on the page. That's where your tier 3 support would come in. Think of this as another opportunity for them to learn the content outside of their core instruction. So you want as often as possible to have your tier 2 instruction aligned to your tier 1 instructions for that instructional coherence that we talked about last time. Every time that it's possible, you want it as aligned as possible to what they're doing in core. That's why we said that you could potentially be using grade level materials in tier 2 if you're just pulling something from their core block and you're providing further direct and explicit instruction, or you're providing further scaffolds or more time for practice. but you could also be using some below grade level content or materials when you're helping these students as well, especially if maybe you're using a specific program instead of pulling from tier 1. For tier 2 students, you want to meet with them about 3 to 5 times a week for roughly 20 to 40 minutes. And you want to, at all costs, avoid pulling them from that core instruction, because remember, they're all entitled to that 60 minutes of core instruction. So this should be happening outside of that block. You want to target your specific skills with each student that you have data to support they are struggling with, and give them lots of explicit instruction and interactions and opportunities for them to have some guided and independent practice with feedback. That feedback component is so important to make sure students actually know if they're doing what they should be doing or if they're still not understanding it. And then you may have to go back and do another model or some more direct and explicit instruction from there. When you have students in tier 2 and tier 3, that's where we want to really start talking about this progress monitoring component. And I know this might not make a ton of sense right now, which I just moved my whole screen over, so give me just a second. But I want to mention it now because it's so integral to today's lesson. So when you are working with students in tier 2, you want to have a minimum of 3 progress monitoring data points relative to the aim line. Let's talk about what the aim line is. So when you have progress monitoring data, you want to be able to plot it on a graph, like the scores that they make on their different progress monitoring assessments, basically. And when you plot those on the graph, you'll be able to draw lines to the different points so you can see the trend of the student, whether they're trending towards progressing or they're staying the same or if they're regressing. The aim line is going to be a line that you have on that graph where you have the progress monitoring information. And it's developed by plotting the student's diagnostics data and then also plotting whatever the 50th percentile benchmark is for their grade level and having that line connected. That's the aim line for that student. So you can see when you plot their actual progress monitoring where they are in relation to that goal of the aim line, basically. And I'll show you what that looks like too in a moment. But in tier 2, you want to have 3 progress monitoring points over the course of like 6 to 8 weeks of intervention, and within that cycle before you decide to change their intervention or change a specific variable to their intervention. And then again, we have another decision tree that follows the same exact process for tier 2, where it asks, is the student demonstrating adequate progress according to curricular assessments and progress monitoring in their instruction, yes versus no. And it brings you through all of the different possible scenarios or general scenarios that you could have and help you decide, do I need to keep the student in tier 2? Do I need to change a specific variable about their intervention, or do I need to elevate them to tier 3? And what evidence do I need to back up those decisions, basically? The data points that you need, how long you need to have been tracking those data points, all of that. So that's all housed in these trees. And then for tier 3, that's our intensive intervention. That's the students who are having a lot of challenges with their word recognition. They're struggling to actually read the words that they're seeing. So that's impeding their ability to access grade level content. So these students are usually going to be on like some kind of intervention program. And it needs to be like one of those research-based intensive intervention programs that they'll be on daily. And I have the link to our like LDOE approved intervention programs on your handout, which I thought I had it on here, but if somebody wants, one of my co-hosts want to drop that in the chat just so people have it, it's an Excel sheet that has all the different foundational intervention programs that we have approved, if your district were so inclined to look at one of those programs. Tier 3 intervention, it should be delivered daily for a minimum of 30 minutes in small groups or even maybe in individual settings, but usually no more than 3 students in a group. It should be obviously more frequent. It should be much more intensive and much more individualized based on whatever their assessed needs were. And again, you want to avoid pulling them out of tier 1 to give them their tier 3 intervention. The progress monitoring happens much more frequently in tier 3. It should be happening weekly with these students. And then you should have, again, a minimum of 3 progress monitoring data points relative to the aim line over 6 to 8 weeks of intervention collected before you decide to change something within their intervention. And progress monitoring of the tier 3 intervention should continue even if a student is identified or eligible for special education services. And then again, same thing. We do have, if you go to on the actual document, you can actually click on the links that are in here. But again, you answer these questions at the end of each of the boxes for starting up here. And then you kind of make decisions based on what's going on in that student's progression. But effective intervention has to include a proportional increase to the direct and explicit instruction that's happening as the level of support increases. So that's why we increase the duration or the frequency of instruction from tier 2 to tier 3. If children are not responding well to tier 1 and tier 2 instruction, or if they're eligible for special education services, then that intensive support through tier 3 intervention is probably a good place for them to be. Students in 3 through 12 who are demonstrating some minimal progress in tier 2 instruction might just need some more additional support as well in tier 3. That will be something you need to look at your data. That's why you need so many data points over a period of time to determine what is the next instructional decision for each student. Students who do need tier 3 support are going to have low scores on their diagnostic and as well on various parts of the code knowledge. We looked at LIFT last time because it's a free program that's available to all of you. There's a code knowledge inventory. If they need tier 3 intervention, they're going to have several deficits in that code knowledge inventory. If you have a paid program that your district is using, they should have some other kind of code knowledge assessment that they'll be using to determine if students or where students have specific deficits for tier 3 intervention. But just remember that tier 2 and tier 3 are all happening in addition to their tier 1 high quality core instruction. So that helps us to fill out the rest of this chart we looked at in the review section today. So tier 1, they're using their tier 1 high quality core high quality instructional materials, and then they are getting it for about 90 minutes, 30 minutes a small group every day. Tier 2, you're having your core aligned instruction where it's as closely aligned to what's happening in their tier 1 instruction as possible. It may be focusing on things like vocabulary or comprehension strategies, happening 3 to 5 times a week, 20 to 40 minutes in small groups. And then lastly, your struggling readers, they may need further support daily, 30 minutes a day or more in smaller groups or individualized to help with their specific reading deficits. If you go on the TPLS framework to pages 13 through 21, which I'm going to bring you to those, starting here on page 13, actually, I lied. Oh yeah, 13. Yeah. Page 13, it starts with tier 1 and it kind of goes more in depth for all the different grade bands, some considerations to make when you are in these tiers of support, some links to some other support material that you might need, best practices, questions to ask yourself about tier 1 and tier 2, tier 3 support, and then when to start elevating students to other tiers. It goes all the way through page 21 for each of the 3 tiers of support. So I just wanted to make sure that you were aware that it was here, on what pages it was, so that you can refer back to that later on. And it ends on page 21 where they have a small disclaimer about special education and dyslexia. Okay, so one thing that I think a lot of secondary educators want to say when they hear this is, okay, well, when do I do all of this? So we have pulled from our staffing and scheduling guidance one sample schedule. I know that there's several different types of schedules that high schools especially could be on. This is an example of a 90-minute block schedule for a high school. And there's some links that we're going to drop in the chat as well to see other examples from different structures. And then we have a middle school one as well. But just to give you an idea of what this 90-minute block one looks like, this is an AB day structure where you see that there's these pockets of non-core intervention periods. That's when students would get pulled for their tier 2 or tier 3 instruction. And then ideally, I mean, what's going to happen is as they get into these upper grades, the need for that intervention should decrease. So that means they have more opportunities to continue to take those non-core elective classes when they get to 11th and 12th grade, because we want to try to get them moving out of intervention as they progress through it. So you can find the other examples of the different structures for both middle and high school schedules at this link here. We're going to drop that in the chat as well. And then there's also the staffing and scheduling guidance for middle and high school. So I'm just going to quickly pull those out so you can just see what they look like. The sample schedules is a big spreadsheet, and you'll see that you can click on the 7-hour day versus the 7.5-hour day. And they have everything from 50-minute classes to 90-minute classes all throughout here. So you can just see some of the ideas that we have provided for 7 versus 7.5-hour day. And then also we have the middle school staffing and scheduling guidance and the high school one, just to show you what those look like. And some of you, I'm sure, have already seen this, but We put this out in December, the updated copy, and it'll have, you can also get to that spreadsheet that I just put on the screen from here as well. It's linked in here. And it'll go through some of the things to consider, how to structure your schedule, all of that stuff for both middle and high school. So you should have access to that both on your breakout room handout and Canopy. And then if my co-host could drop those in the chat as well, just for an extra access point, that would be greatly appreciated. All right, let me go to my next slide. So I'm going to put you in a breakout room and let's dive back into progress monitoring now that we have all the tiers kind of hopefully situated in our heads. So for progress monitoring, let's talk about some best practices for this. So grade level and intervention teams should be using a progress monitoring to make decisions for each individual student, because it shows you that student's responsiveness to whatever intervention and support you are giving them. And then you can make adjustments as needed. So that data is highly valuable. It is not something that you just want to do if you have tier 3 support going on every week from a compliance standpoint. Like, oh, well, they said I got it every Friday. I got to do a progress monitoring measure. So I'm going to do it every Friday. You should be using that data to really, really give that student the most individualized support that they could possibly have. That data from your progress monitoring will show that student's rate of improvement, and you can compare it to that aim line we talked about earlier to see if they're on target to meet their goal or if something needs to be adjusted from their intervention. So progress monitoring should be ongoing. It should be frequent. It's formal data that you're going to use to assess a student's performance, to quantify a student's rate of improvement or their responsiveness to the instruction or intervention, and to evaluate the actual effectiveness of the intervention and instruction using some valid and reliable measures. So I have this little image up on the screen where one box says monitoring progress and one says progress monitoring, and there is a difference between the two. When we're monitoring progress, like most of our teachers are doing that every single day in their classroom anyway throughout their instruction. That's like some immediate data they can get. Sometimes it's qualitative, it can be quantitative, but it's real-time instructional decisions they make based off of how students are maybe responding right in front of them during the lesson. It's used for all students, and it can be informal, like I just talked about, where maybe you're having a class discussion and if you're the teacher and you notice like you need to step in and intervene on something because students are not quite getting it. But it's through feedback. You provide feedback, but there's questioning and other things like that. It could be through some more like formal forms of data collection, but it's different than progress monitoring. Progress monitoring means you have standardized delivery using a valid and reliable tool. It requires graph data, which we just talked about. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a moment. It should be administered weekly to monthly, kind of depending on which tier of support the student is receiving. It should be ongoing. You should have 4 to 6 data points usually for valid interpretation to see of like how a student is actually progressing. And it should be used for entitlement decisions as well as like, do I need to make an adjustment to my student's intervention block? And those variables we talked about last time. It could be anything from changing how frequent you're meeting with them, changing the time, like the duration of the meeting with them. Maybe they need less students in their small group. Maybe you need to pivot to a different approach for a skill. But we talked about the different variables that might need to be changed last session, and how you really should only change 1 or 2 at a time if the data supports it. So that way you can know, like, is my adjustment working? But frequent retesting of these targeted skills, the targeted skills is the skill that you are instructing them on in that intervention, is what you need to see if adequate growth is happening as a result of whatever instruction or intervention support you're giving that student. And it needs to be through a valid assessment measure. So the majority of our secondary students are going to be progress monitored using an oral reading fluency probe, or ORF. You might recall from our previous sessions that the secondary students use ORF as a standard measure because fluency is the key to determining if a student does have those challenges with reading. The frequency recommendation for progress monitoring in grades 4 through 8 is going to change for oral reading fluency depending on that individual student's level of risk for reading difficulty. So if they're at risk or in the red, you're going to want to do maybe every 2 to 3 weeks. If they have some risk, maybe every 4 to 5 weeks. So it will depend on each individual student, how often you're going to progress monitor them. You may also find that for progress monitoring, you're going to have to use some kind of off grade level tool to meet the need. You're going to progress monitor them at the instructional level. So if you're already working with them with a skill that is below their grade level, that's also what you're going to progress monitor them on. You're not going to pull a grade level piece for progress monitoring when they're not already being instructed on grade level for tier 2 and tier 3. So if they're in tier 3 and they're having some foundational reading deficits, that might be phonemic awareness or word recognition. So you might have to select a off grade level progress monitoring measures there to make some strategic decisions about their next steps. But those measures should reflect whatever level of instruction they're receiving in intervention. And the primary goal should be to demonstrate student progress towards proficiency to those grade level benchmarks as quickly as possible. So to just show you what this looks like, the DIBELS 8th Administration and Scoring Guide, I'm going to show you this because it's free. If you already have a program that your district is using, you should have something like this in the program to be able to help you progress monitor. But for DIBELS, I'm going to go to the website and to the Administration and Scoring Guide, which you can find on the website as well. And then I have my co-host drop these in the chat. They are also on your breakout room handouts. On the website, I've gone to the materials, and at the top, you'll see the Administration and Scoring Guide, and then they have some benchmark materials, and then they have a whole section on progress monitoring materials. And let's just pick grade 7, for example. If you open that up, it'll have materials for progress monitoring measures in there. Hold on. Open it. I thought I already had it open. It has maze, and it also has oral reading fluency in there, which it doesn't want to open correctly for me. But it has directions. It has a student packet and a scoring packet. So it has directions of how to administer the progress monitoring, as well as how to score it. And it even gives you a little chart so you can start the process of plotting it. And then there's also the administration and scoring guide that comes with it that brings you through that whole process as well. And you can kind of go through the table of contents here just so you can see what it looks like. There's some front matter in there and things that you are going to want to look at the first time that you use this, what all the different measures are, like what they're actually testing, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware of this if you are a district that is not already using a program that has progress monitoring materials in it for you, which it kicked me out of my thing, but that's okay. I can get right back into it. There we go. Okay. So I just want to make sure you're aware of those resources for progress monitoring tools for those of you that don't have the paid program. If you have the paid program, use whatever's already in there because that's where you should be pulling your instructional materials anyway. There's no need for you to go outside of it. Just make sure everybody's really well trained on that program if you are using a program, anybody who's involved in this process. You can use the DIBELS progress monitoring if you're not using the program already, and that data that you get from whatever progress monitoring measure you're using should be graphs. So some programs might already have this embedded into what you are doing. If not, you can make an Excel spreadsheet and it'll plot the graphs for you. If you're not super great with Excel, neither am I. I feel like every time I have to use Excel, I have to Google how to put in different functions. They are all over the internet. But just so you know, this is like kind of what it will look like. You'll have the student scores like are represented right here in yellow. You'll see they have the different points of the different progress monitoring measures that they've had. And then the lines are connected to show the trends. And then the aim line for this student is this blue dotted line where we have their starting point, and then we have where we want them to end, which is the 50th percentile of their grade level benchmark. And then we just plotted a line between the two so we can see how they're doing in relation to that aim line of where we want them to get to. And then you just add scores as they move through progress monitoring. So that's what that looks like starting at beginning of year, moving through end of year. We're going to kind of look at some more on this in just a moment, but I do want you to also be aware that on pages 10 through 12 of the TPLS framework, there is some more further information about progress monitoring as well and the different types of assessments that we use. So starting here on page 10, we'll talk about progress monitoring. Again, you have access to the DIBELS 8th Administration and Scoring Guide here, some information on the different types of progress monitoring measures and things like that. So that's also in your TPLS framework. All right. We're not going to watch this video today just for time's sake. It is Dr. Stolar, who is the same expert that we've been watching videos of in the previous sessions, she just goes more in depth about how invaluable progress monitoring is as part of the process for intervention. In this little video, it's not long, it's like 4 or 5 minutes, but just because we're already, it's almost 11 o'clock already, I want to make sure we get to everything. It's just impossible for you to really know how students are doing if you're not truly progress monitoring them. And we don't want to leave a student in intervention longer than they have to be, or in an intervention setting where they're not actually getting the support that they need. So we need to make sure that we're monitoring the effectiveness of those interventions as we're moving through. So some recaps of the video, in case you don't get to go back and watch it, is that you should have, teams on your campus that can develop a clear plan to ensure that the fidelity of progress monitoring process to limit inconsistencies in the administration. So that goes back to making sure everyone involved in this process is well trained on whatever program or sources that you're using. Progress monitoring should be conducted by the classroom teacher or the interventionist with the most knowledge of that student. And it should be done at, again, I said this earlier, the instructional level. And just remember, it is not a compliance piece, just a box for us to check off. We should be using that data to decide if students need adjustments or not to what their support is. So that brings me to responding to progress monitoring data. It should elicit whatever the appropriate adjustment is for that student on their literacy plan and whatever intervention and support they're receiving. That's why it's so important that it should be a reliable and valid source of progress monitoring and not just some like random thing that we give students once a week. It should be aligned to whatever their instructional needs are. Some things that you want to keep in mind, if students are showing progress, the educator or the team should determine if the student needs to be moved down to a lower tier of support. So maybe they're in tier 2 and they're showing significant growth. Maybe they don't need tier 2 support anymore. They might be able to move down to tier 1. Or there may be other skills that they showed a challenge or a deficit with that you can move on to giving them support in because they have now mastered whatever the skill was you were instructing them on. If they're not responding to your intervention or not quickly enough, you need to make some adjustments to their plan. And that's where we change 1 or 2 variables that we talked about earlier, like increased time, increased frequency, smaller groups, more intensive instruction, or potentially even moving them from tier 1 to tier 2 or to tier 2 to tier 3 if the data shows that it's necessary. But you only want to change 1 or 2 variables at a time. That way it's kind of easier to track if what you did as a result of the last progress monitoring data measure was actually effective or not. And you can use those decision trees once again to help you. It asks you about collecting that data through progress monitoring and what that's showing in terms of the student's progress to help you determine what the next step should be. So again, those are on pages 43 through 46 of the TPLS framework. Okay, so let's look at some progress monitoring examples in action. It's important to track those data points in that visual representation because not only are you able to see trends as the instructor, but you are also better informed when you communicate with the student and when you can communicate with parents as well. They can see how is the student progressing as a result of the intervention that you are giving. So this graph that I'm going to show you guys is from a year-long oral reading fluency progress of a middle school student. He was screened at 3 points in the school year or benchmarked at 3 points in the school year, which are all the ones highlighted in yellow up here. So in September, October, January, March, and May. And then in between those, he was progress monitored where it's indicated with PM1, PM2, PM3, so on and so forth. And it was tracked on this spreadsheet. And then you'll see right here, they have what the expected benchmark, the aim, and the student's name is Dean, how he scored at each of these different points. Now they haven't got they're in January. They haven't gotten to these other progress monitoring points in March. So it's not the entire school year, but it does show you where they want him to be by the end of the year as well on his words correct per minute. So his graph looks like this. He's got Dean is in purple. His aim line is in red, and then that benchmark is in blue. And then they chose to do this like linear progression of if he continues at this rate, kind of where he would be by the end of the year, their prediction for it. This is doesn't necessarily need to be here. The most important part is that you have that aim line and the student actual progress monitoring measures. So you could potentially just have the 2 lines. And again, remember the aim line is determined by the student's beginning of year words correct per minute or whatever the skill is, their beginning of year score. And then you plot where the 50th percentile benchmark is for their grade level and draw the line there. And then that's how you get your aim line. And notice that it meets the benchmark line right here. And then Dean's doing okay. There he is on purple right here. So just so you can see his progress monitoring data points show how quickly his progress is happening. That black line is the projection like we talked about. But if you're using a program that has all this in there embedded, it will create this for you. If not, this was just created on an Excel spreadsheet, and you can make a template for every student that you're going to be needing to progress monitor on. So I'm going to put you in a breakout room, and I think it's 2 questions. So we're almost done. All right. I think everybody's back in the main room. Okay, so let's just take, I want to give us maybe 3-4 minutes because I have a couple of things I want to wrap up this session with before 11:30. If anybody is comfortable with coming off of mute and just sharing what your group talked about for Julia in particular, if anybody could be one of my co-hosts, if you were in a room, or any of you that were in the rooms, just if you want to come off mute, I would love to hear some of the thoughts that you guys had in terms of what's going on with Julia.
Well, we talked about even though Julia was showing growth, she's still like way below level. Changing, adjust the intervention size, maybe the group size, evaluate her other skills, see what else is preventing her from getting that, oral fluency, moving her to tier 3.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else anybody else talked about in the other groups? Thank you. She's progressing, just not at a rate that is going to get her where she needs to be. She's well below that aim line and that benchmark line for sure, even though she is showing progress.
We did discuss maybe having a diagnostic. That way we could target it. She's showing growth, but it's minimal. So
Right.
where is it we can exactly a more targeted approach to where we can help her out at?
Right. So, and we start them off with a diagnostic right at the beginning of the year. But as you can see, I mean, she's had, at this point, they're all the way in January. So there may be some other diagnostic assessment we need to give this student to see why is she not making growth. What about, did anybody talk about some of the specific variables that maybe could be adjusted for this student other than maybe further testing? Any other thoughts around that?
Our group talked about the fact that, yes, she is making some growth, even though she's not really at the point where she's going to close that gap and make it to the benchmark. At this point, it's not looking that way anyway. But perhaps changing either the amount of intervention that she's receiving. So instead of 3 days a week, maybe 5 days a week, or the length of the time, the duration of each one of the intervention sessions.
Those are both definite possibilities that you could adjust one of those at a time and see how she does from there. Because she is already at mid-year, you may have other data points too that you can look at, because I heard one of the other groups did mention even potentially moving her to tier 3. You would need to look at all of her other data points as well before you made that decision. But as you all have seemed to come to the conclusion of, while she is showing some progress, she is not progressing fast enough and to meet her goal at the end. So something does need to be changed to her intervention. So good. But that's to show you the value of that progress monitoring data. Like, yeah, we see that she's doing better, but it's not good enough at this point from what we've been giving her to get her to where she needs to be. And that's why we need to use that data to drive those decisions of something needs to change for this student, and to kind of dig deeper into what it is we could change. And then this was just the question for you guys to answer on here on Canopy. I want to go, before we close out, there's a couple of things I want to talk about or highlight for you all before you hop off of the call. My colleague Wendy she's on the call today, and some of you got to be in a breakout room with her. She has been working on some webinar series for the TPLS framework. She has already done one for system leaders that there's a recording of that we can drop the link in the chat to the recording. And then she actually has one tomorrow for school leaders that you can hop on between 1 and 2 o'clock if you want. And the Zoom link is right there that we can drop in the chat as well. Wendy, if you have anything else you want to add to this little plug for you, feel free to come off of mute if you do have anything.
No, we just look forward to seeing hopefully some of the school leaders tomorrow. That one will.
Oh no, she froze. Wendy froze. Maybe we'll get her back. And then Wendy, you froze.
Oh, I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
It's been spotty today up here at Claiborne.
Yeah.
And no, I was just saying we'd love to have you at the seminars, the webinars. The videos will be posted for each one, and then also be on the lookout for TPLS sessions at Teacher Leader Summit for sure.
And we're gonna get those 2 links dropped in the chat for you. Really, it's great for those of you to like really need to dig into that framework. Then we also have some free PD available. You may have already gotten some communication about this, but I want to make sure that we still get this message out wide. Some Keys to Literacy is going to host a few different 1-day Zoom trainings for advanced word study. And what's the other one? Keys Adolescent Literacy. Yeah. So both of those, I've taken both of those courses. Actually, they're very helpful. They give you lots of like resources that you can actually use in your classroom and things like that. So there's a Google form if you would like to register for any of the dates that are still available. The first one is April 1st, and we only have, I think, like 3 or 4 spots left in that one, but all the other dates still have a good bit of room left. So if somebody could drop the link for me in the chat for that Google form for anyone who is interested, it is really great for those, especially for teachers. So you can share that the Google form out with your teachers as well. Also, I think it's really important for secondary teachers to be knowledgeable around the science of reading. I found that learning about the science of reading was very eye-opening for my own educational practices, and we have a free course on Canopy as well for science of reading. While it is technically a requirement of Act 108, which is for our younger elementary teachers, that they all have to be trained in this, the information that you get from this really does help inform your instruction as a secondary teacher. And in fact, I've been going through the course myself. And I just finished the section on assessment, and they had all kinds of stuff in there about things that have to do with what we just covered today. So it would be a good reinforcement for you to go through. And we're going to drop the link to this little document in the chat. And then those are the course codes for you to access the part 1 and the part 2 of the course on Canopy as well. So I'll leave that up for just another second in case anybody's like writing down the course codes or anything.
I'm actually taking that also, the science and art of teaching part 1. I took the science of reading, the science of reading like way back. I don't remember 2021 or something, but I thought this would be, I was told this would be a good refresher. So
yes, are you liking it so far? Is it informative for you?
yeah,
Good.
It's bringing back a lot of stuff that I probably had forgotten already.
Yeah, it's always good to refresh on those things too.
All right.
And then just quickly, I did record sessions 1 and 2. I've also recorded this session. The recordings have been posted to our Literacy Professional Growth page. I also went ahead and embedded the recordings into Canopy for sessions 1 and 2. So if you have any colleagues or if you haven't done one of them yet that are going to do it asynchronously, you actually could just also click play on the video and follow along with how we did it in the session as well. So it's there. The links on the professional growth page do not have anything other than just the recording. There's no like resources or breakout room handouts or slides or anything. So to get the best bang for your buck, I would still go and use the professional learning platform on Canopy to access that. Our last session will be on April 30th from 10 to 11:30 a.m. Remember, I told you guys it would be a really hands-on session where you're going to get to work with others and use some scenarios to apply what we've covered in these sessions. And I'll have like a little bit at the beginning where I'll kind of cover some material, but for the most part, most of that hour and a half will be you guys digging into some scenarios. And again, if you need that course code for this course, it's right here on the screen. You can share that with anybody that you think this would be relevant to at your sites as well. And lastly, to close this out, if you guys could, we're going to drop in the chat, the link to this little reflection survey. I just like to look at the feedback to try to make sure that we are always meeting the needs of the field. If you could fill that out, it's not super long. I would really appreciate it. And I hope to see all of you and more on April 30th. So if you don't have any other questions, you're free to go. If you do, if you need to hang back, I can stay on for a couple of minutes. But otherwise, thank you so much for your participation today.
Okay, you said it was going to be on April the 30th?
Yes, I could go back to that. Yeah. Go.
Okay, and is it at 10?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.